Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. David Nutt can't be here today, but I work very closely with him, and he sees these slides, so I think he will approve. One of the things I'm very curious about is why we heard so little, or I heard so little today about decisions. After all, the point of expert elicitation must be to gain information that will improve decisions. So I'm going to talk more about that. Next. I want to start with a paper that appeared in 2007 in The Lancet was called Development of a Rational Scale to Assess the Harm of Drugs of Potential Misuse. Next. The experts that David Nutt and his colleagues collected for this, they individually scored 20 drugs on 9 criteria using 4-point scales. And we've seen scales like that today. After group discussion and revision, scores were averaged across experts and criteria. Now, when I saw a preliminary draft of this paper, I thought, oh dear, there's some problems here. And we've heard plenty about those problems today. So many of you, Sama, Dan, you agree, and as do others, that the problem is, next, experts always disagree. So how do we deal with that? We've heard a lot about averaging, of not averaging, of doing all kinds of things to individual experts, but I have a bit of a problem with many of these solutions that I've heard today. Next, what I would like to know is, how can we move from this to that? And the answer to in my view, is to combine technical modeling with decision conferencing. So now what I'd like to do is talk about what I mean by technical modeling and what I mean by decision conferencing. And you'll see that these both are the ingredients, I think, of good expert elicitation. Next. Well, let's first start with the technical process. It's called multi-criteria decision analysis. That was first published in 1976 by Howard Rafa, professor at Harvard. He's the lower picture, and his then graduate student, Ralph Keeney. That was a very popular book, and it was revised by 1993. I just want to pick out a couple of quotes from those books. First of all, when a decision involves multiple objectives, and this is almost always the case with important problems, multi-attribute utility theory forms a foundation for applying decision analysis. They also said the important addition since 1976 concerns value functions that address strength of preferences between pairs of consequences. You're going to see me using this very frequently. What I mean by preference is a liking for A over B. And that is the secret of good elicitation. Next. So that's the technical component of expert judgment elicitation. Next. So what is decision analysis? Well, here it is, Race again, publishing way back in 1968. The spirit of decision analysis is divide and conquer. Decompose a complex problem into simpler problems, get one's thinking straight about these simpler problems, paste these analyses together with logical glue, and come out with a program of action for the complex problem. Next. Now I'd like to talk not about the technical process, which I just discussed, but rather the decision conferencing. What is a decision conference? Well, decision conferencing is one or more facilitated workshops. It's attended by key players representing the diversity of perspectives, which we've heard about over and over again today, and its importance, how diverse and how many people. Facilitated by an impartial specialist in group processes and decision analysis, using a requisite or good enough model created on the spot to help provide structure to thinking. And all of this accommodates the material, personal, and social worlds. And by the way, one decision conference can be anywhere from a half day to 2 days. This is all going to be done quickly. Next. Okay, that's the social component of expert judgment elicitation. Now what I would like to do is put these together with a case study, because when I brought this to the attention of David Nutt and his co-authors in the 2007 paper, they agreed to try it again. Okay, and next, what I want to do is now show you how what we did next led to a 2010 study, also published in the Lancet. Now, this is all about the harm of drugs. It's trying to improve on the 2007 case study. And well, take a look at these 20 drugs and see if you can find your favorite recreational drug here on this slide. Might be somewhere, maybe more than one. Next. One of the things that we need to think about, though, is, well, what are we going to evaluate harm on? Now, David invited me to the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs. That's one of the groups that help the Home Office to develop good policy. And the first question I asked this group in an in a very simple decision conference with quite a lot of people, it was at least 15. The first thing I asked them was, well, what do you mean by harm? It took a day and a half to develop all of these 16 harm criteria. And you can see they're divided up into overall harm to users. And the overall harm to the users is divided up into the physical, psychological, and social harms. And the ones at the very end are the very criteria against which we want to evaluate those 20. Well, the lower part is harms to others, and that's again physical and social, psychological, sorry, and that's injury. But there were several for social harm. So altogether, 16 criteria with well-defined understanding that is agreed by everybody. Expert elicitation is so important because everybody has to agree about what we mean by, for the example, next, drug-specific mortality, for example. What does that mean? Well, that means dying from an overdose of the drug. And you all know what economic cost, it's the total economic cost to everybody. Okay, next. You're gonna see those two in a minute again. So what we were doing was direct preference judgments. You can just click, click, click until I get 4 things showing. There we go. The most harmful drug on each criterion was scored at 100. The least harmful drug on a criterion was scored as 0. Now, these are like Celsius scales. 0 doesn't mean necessarily no harm, though it often did, but it means least harm. 100 was the most harm for a particular criterion. And when the scoring is done, I'm checking to make sure that people are looking at differences in scores, because it's the differences, comparative differences, that represent differences in degrees of harm. Next. Okay, we're going to stay on this slide for a minute. I want you to look at the left. How harmful on this criterion? That was the one I showed you earlier, drug-related mortality. If you look down those 20 options, the 20 drugs, you'll see that LSD was a 0, magic mushrooms only a 1, but heroin is 100. Yes, you can die directly from an injection of too much heroin. But you see all the differences there. They need more than a 4-point scale, all the way down to 1 and 0. So we use 100-point scales, though very often people are only using 5s, 10s, 15s, and so forth. But no, sometimes they want a 1. Now that's called scoring the drugs. The next one is called weighting the criteria. So I asked the question, how big are the differences and how much do you care about them? So what we're looking at here is drug-related mortality, the difference between LSD and heroin compared to the difference between alcohol the difference between methadone and alcohol for economic cost. And eventually, with a group discussion, they agreed that the one on the right was twice as important as the one on the left. Now, to calculate weighted scores, you must have some sense of what those weights really mean, because they are scale constants that allow you to multiply preference values by weights. And what result did we get when we did that? Next. Here are the weighted preference values, eventually published in the 2010 paper. You'll notice that alcohol turned out to be the most harmful, all the way down to magic mushrooms, which is only a 6. The blue, of course, is harm to users. And you can see that alcohol is twice as harmful as anything else, more than twice than anything else of any of those drugs. Harm to others, that is, harm to others, compared to harm to users. Let's compare next. Oh, there we go. Let's compare the 2007 bar graphs with the 2010 ones. First, if you focus on the left ones, the colors there represent their classification in the UK. Class A, they're the toughest ones. And those are the reds. And you'll see that reds and blues, the colors are all dispersed throughout that whole thing, which suggests very clearly that although the government is supposed to pass laws to minimize the harm of drugs, that's not what they're doing. Their basis for classification is something different from the harm of drugs. On the right, what you see here in harm to users and others, you'll see, first of all, a different ordering. Alcohol is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the left. It's first on the left. Lots of them are different. So the left is with expert elicitation and no modeling, simply averaging across all the criteria and across all the equal criteria, equal weights across the experts, whereas there is weighting on the right, but the weighting applies to differences along the measures. So you get a different answer. So my view is that expert elicitation with modeling must be better. Do I have proof of that? Next. Yes. This whole study was replicated with different groups of experts in 3 different countries. And here are the results. Next. These are the correlations between the final weighted preference values. You don't see those kinds of correlations in the social sciences at all. So next. Here's what I conclude. Expert judgment elicited in a decision conference guided by impartial facilitation can express precise quantitative probabilities, value scores, and trade-offs among the criteria. But participants transform their implicit and qualitative judgments and experience, both needed, always need to interpret data. It doesn't speak for itself ever, into explicit and quantitative results that are valid, dependable, and replicable. So now I ask the question back to ISAM Jen. That's what we did. Would this be useful to you? Thank you.